Into the Spiderverse review. The story it centers around Miles Morales, a Spider-Man I'm pretty unfamiliar with because I don't pay attention to the current comics. He's been around for about the about 2001 or 2002, I think. The premise of the movie revolves around multiple Spider-Men, and this has been done before in the comics in a different way with the Clone Saga. It's been done on the 90s animated series with uh, the Spider Wars. So the animation looks more like a Telltale game. It's very different than most of the stuff that's out there. And it's not that great looking on the eyes, really. But it does have some very promising standout moments, like where, it does comic panels, thought bubbles, and action bubbles that pop out of the screen. It's very interesting to see in the action. Those moments are pretty outstanding. But the animation itself is pretty lackluster most of the way through. There were a few standout moments, like when Miles is swinging through the city carrying an unconscious Peter Parker. There's the traffic and the life of New York City, the people crossing the street. There's so much detail to them, and it does feel like there's a lot of action, it feels very lived in, very populated. Other than that, the animation doesn't pop too much. Just a few standout moments. I can see this being an inspiration for this style of animation to come with it, because it does feel like a motion comic in a different way than motion comics are, though. Almost like a VR comic. Moving on from the animation, though, like I said, I'm unfamiliar with the Miles Morales character, so it was a little bit hard to get into. I don't like the idea of multiple people having Spider-Man's powers because he's got a pretty unique skill set compared to other heroes. DC has multiple Green Lanterns, well, not really multiple Superman, but they have Supergirl, Bizarro, Cyborg Superman, but he's more like a robot. But and then there's like the Bat Family, and there's just so many people in DC Comics with the same power set. Uh, Spider-Man's pretty unique. He sets in the Marvel world, and a lot of the Marvel characters tend to have more unique power sets. So populating this with multiple Spider-Man, it kind of takes away from the unique set of skills that Spider-Man has. But moving on with that, Miles Morales has some interesting relationships in this movie, mostly with his father and his uncle. And early on, you get the sense of that, high school awkwardness. He's very insecure. He doesn't want his, high school career or whatever you want to call it to be full of humiliation, and that's what he's getting here. And I guess that's pretty relatable for most audience members. Pretty quickly into the film, he gets bit by a spider and starts to freak out about his spider powers. A lot of the jokes fall flat for me. There is Gwen Stacy here that he seems to have a crush on, and vice versa. She starts to have one later in the film, but there was an awkward. None of this was really connecting with me on any level until he starts to feel like he starts to learn he's got spider powers, freaks out like thinking it's puberty at first and stuff, and until he crashes into a window and falls into some Spider-Man comics and starts looking at them. Things That's when things get interesting, because seeing comic books that you've seen in person on screen in this style of animation, real Spider-Man comics, and seeing him flip through the pages, That was pretty neat. The way they looked in this animation and him this it was also very convenient though for him to flip through these pages and realize that hey, he's a Spider-Man too. So he goes back to sort of where he got bit from the spider, and I'm gonna be light as possible on spoilers. I should have mentioned that up front. I'm gonna be light as possible on spoilers, but there are some things. If you're familiar with Miles Morales, you know how this goes. He runs into the original Spider-Man, Peter Parker, and in this moment, seeing that Spider-Man on screen, I felt really connected to the character. I felt interested, engaged, immersed. Uh, the Spider-Man comes off like such a legend in presence on screen. But things go south as Spider-Man fights multiple villains and Miles is present. He's very intimidated, very insecure. Like he's not the hero. He's not as brave as Peter. Miles Morales is a very different kind of guy. But things go south, and Miles ends up getting tasked with stopping this machine called the Collider that will pretty much collapse multiple dimensions into each other. He gets tasked with handling this before he takes off with the device Peter gave him. It's almost like a USB drive. Before he takes off with the device, he kind of hides out in the shadow long enough to see Kingpin confront a trapped Spider-Man. And Kingpin's design, it's very terrible. The animation model they used, it's a hideous design. But Kingpin himself in this story, he's a pretty threatening villain. As far as animated villains go, this one's pretty threatening with what he does multiple times in this film. And, you know, this stuff leads to some heartbreaking stuff for the world itself. And as an audience member, you can really feel it. Uh, the death of Peter Parker. That's not too much of a spoiler, really, because that sets the whole film in motion. So Miles has this device and he's trying to learn his spider powers. He ends up breaking that device and feeling like a screw up. He goes to attend Spider Man's funeral. He buys a costume from a costume shop. This is a very interesting, surreal moment. Stan Lee is in that costume shop saying to Miles, I'm going to miss him. And as we all know, Stan Lee died this year. This was not released before his death. So it's just kind of weird to see, you know, Stan Lee saying, I'm going to miss him now that he's actually dead. And this is coming out after his death. So that was pretty surreal. The Spider-Man funeral is very interesting because Spider-Man is outed as Peter Parker in his death, and they have a memorial service for him. The Mary Jane animated model looks spot on. The Aunt May looks pretty good too. And they have this big memorial service for Spider-Man's death. Following that, Miles goes to visit his grave and he runs into Peter B. Parker. That's when we get kind of a recap of who he is. And it's very similar to the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. This guy got me really engaged into the story and interested. Because without him, I don't know if I would have continued to watch this because I can't really relate to Miles. It's not so much I can't relate to him, it's just I'm unfamiliar with him and don't like the idea of there being multiple spider people, like any any more than like them being just multiple Peter Parkers. But from here, we get a funny intro, how his life's gone. He's divorced, he's middle aged, he's let himself go. He's got a gut on him. He's wearing sweatpants throughout most of a big chunk of this film, not most of it, but a big chunk of this film. It's hilarious to see since he feels so much like the Tobey Maguire, the Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. It feels like this is you catching up with that Spider-Man. How things would have gone if that franchise didn't go south with the third movie. these two characters have great chemistry together too on screen. Very funny stuff when they interact personally. Also, some very deep moments between them. So they decide. At first, it comes off like a jerk too. The Miles. One good thing I can say about Miles and Peter B. Parker is, unlike most of the characters in this movie, they have an arc. They start out completely different, and by the end of the film, they're completely different. And they have strong character arcs. The only other people that really have strong character arcs throughout this film, you don't really get much of them, but you have Miles' father and Miles' uncle. They start out one place and they end up in a completely different place too. But you only get little like snippets, sprinkles of that. Some very strong moments though that don't require them to have be on screen for very long, honestly. But with the team up of these two, it just goes for a joyride from here until they meet the other Spider-Men, or Spider People, I should say, since Gwen Stacy is one of them. Uh, Peter B. Parker and Miles Morales, they try to stop Kingpin together and his crew of villains, but they end up going to Aunt May with the device. And we get to see the Spider Cave. There's all kinds of costumes in there and hilarious vehicles that Spider-Man never needed in the comic that they made toys of and included in the comic for some strange reason. And we meet all the other Spider-Men or Spider People. They're not that interesting. Aside from Gwen Stacy, Peter B. Parker, and Miles Morales. These guys kind of, I mean, they have their moments, but they mostly clutter up the screen. And that's what it felt like to me, that they were just cluttering up the screen. Nicolas Cage's Spider-Man's pretty interesting. Well, I'd say not very interesting, but lightly interesting. We don't spend too much time on him or focus on him or any of the other ones for that matter. So, following the Spider Cave and the Aunt May, which is just classic Aunt May. One thing I disliked about Homecoming was having a young Aunt May. This Aunt May is classic old Aunt May. She's sweet as hell, but she's got spunk to her. This, but the first scene with all the Spider-Men, or Spider People in it, they once they're on screen all together, it does start to feel very crowded and a little bit annoying. Well, I wouldn't say a little bit annoying. I found the scene where they were all putting pressure on Miles, I found that incredibly annoying and obnoxious and hard to set through. It was kind of cringeworthy. It wasn't very funny. It was intended to be funny, but it wasn't that funny at all. It was more of a nuisance. Following that, Miles goes off on his own for a little bit. And, well, I'm not going to give too much away. I'm just going to say that Miles, even though I'm not really connected with the character or fond of the character that much, he is really fleshed out in this story. And there are some pretty intense moments where he's on the run from villain. And because his lack of confidence and how easily intimidated he is and insecure he is, you feel for him, especially in a tense moment where he's being pursued by somebody who comes off incredibly threatening. Yeah. And a few of the villains, other than Kingpin's model, Scorpion's model in this movie, I did not like at all. I did not like the animated model at all. It just did not set well with me. Neither did Kingpin's. We do get two very emotional moments in here. Uh, the biggest, other than what happens with the Spider-Man funeral, another big moment happens that feels very reminiscent of the death of Uncle Ben, and they do mention the death of Uncle Ben in here. It feels very reminiscent to that, though, in terms of tragedy and how heartbreaking it is. And, you know, you get down to the final fight scene where Miles finally has to step up and all that. Peter B. Parker and Miles Morales have very strong character arcs. Kingpin's motivations, too, are actually surprisingly personal. Very character driven, not just plot, not just Saturday cartoon morning villain. You know, that whole kind of just silly plot for no reason at all that had a very strong motivation in this film. And it kind of makes you think of the Daredevil series, which unfortunately was canceled recently. And that's the movie. I'd say the movie was good, lackluster and annoying for a few big chunks. A lot of the characters didn't feel like they needed to be there at all. Gwen Stacy didn't feel like she needed to be there at all, honestly. And the little kind of romance tease between her and Miles had no substance for me. I found the best chemistry between Miles and Peter B. Parker, and I found some of the best scenes between Miles and his uncle and Miles and his father. So, a lot of people are rating this movie very highly. Some of them comic book fans, critics. A lot of people are rating this movie very highly, but I'm only going to give it a 5 out of 10 because I just don't like the animated style too much. I do like how they included all the comic book stuff that's very respectful and very interesting for its fan base to see, and I can see it influencing future animation and bringing about a whole new kind of groundbreaking material. But Stan Lee, he was very interesting. The end credit scene is very interesting too. Uh, Aunt May, Mary Jane. A lot of the character models are great. Um, a lot of the other Spider-Men, Spider people, were not that interesting at all. And see, that's kind of why I give it a 5 out of 10. It's not just the animated style. Uh, it's just that the whole hype around this movie is for it to be about multiple Spider-Men. I mean, Miles too, but the whole hype around this movie is, you know, multiple Spider-Men, but none of them really have any substance or bring anything real to the story other than Peter B. Parker. He's pretty much the only one that brings anything to the story following the original Spider-Man. So 5 out of 10. Uh, Share your comments, your views, what you thought about the movie. Did you like it? Uh, do you think it's overrated? Because a lot of people seem to really like this movie and it's doing very well. Uh, it does have some cool moments, very enjoyable moments, but also some fairly lackluster and annoying moments. So, like, subscribe, share, check out my other videos. Tell me what you thought of this one. Comment what do you think of this movie. Check out my GoFundMe link. Uh, just stay awesome. Rock on.